Chapter 8. Why don't we use the same banking system that God uses? Do you remember the mortgage meltdown of 2008? Well, when the cameras were rolling, the banking cartel blamed it on the mortgage companies, and the mortgage companies blamed it on Wall Street, and Wall Street blamed it on the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve blamed it on the politicians. And of course, the politicians blamed it on each other because of a lack of consumer confidence fueled by the media. Go figure, right? You know, our obsession with making easy money is going to be our undoing in America, because banks make their money by loaning money with interest added to it. It's what the Bible calls usury, or a more modern translation would call it interest. And God pronounces a special blessing on someone who refuses to do that. In Psalms chapter 15, David imposes a question to the nation of Israel. Who may dwell in your sacred tent, O Lord, and who may live in your holy mountain? He who lends money to the poor without interest, and he who does not accept a bribe against the innocent. Then in Exodus chapter 22, God says, and I quote, if you lend money to any of my people who are poor, you shall not lend it to them like the money lender, and you shall not exact interest from him. And again in Deuteronomy chapter 23, you shall not charge interest on loans to your brother, interest on money, interest on food, interest on anything that is lent for interest. I guess there really is nothing new under the sun, is there? And just to be fair, the Bible does not condemn all uses of interest. If you read everything in the Bible that talks about interest, a majority of them connect the idea of interest with exploiting someone who has fallen on hard times. It's what the Bible condemns is using the principle of interest to exploit people. And then you have this statement by Jesus in Matthew chapter 25. Well, he says, well, then, you should have put my money on deposit with the bankers so that when I returned, I would have at least received, in part, some interest. So let me introduce to you a new concept here that I would call generational prosperity, which is God's version of accumulated compound interest. Now, do you remember the story of Naboth's vineyard in 1 Kings chapter 21? It's where a guy by the name of King Ahab, who was not a very ethical person, asked Nahab to, quote, trade me your vineyard for another one of equal value. And here is his exact answer. He said, the Lord forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my ancestors. You see, according to Jewish law, Naboth had no right to sell or to trade his vineyard without the consent of his entire family. If he had any living relatives left, it was to be passed on to them, but it was not to be sold outside the family name. How did I come to that conclusion? Okay, here's the answer, Leviticus 25. The land must not be sold permanently because the land is mine and you reside in my land as foreigners and strangers. Throughout the land that you hold as a possession, you must provide for the redemption of the land. If one of your fellow Israelites becomes poor and sells some of their property, their nearest relative is to come and redeem what they have sold. You see, it was to be kept within the family. The land was an internal inheritance to the Jewish people, and it was never to be sold outside the family name. And the reason for that? Generational prosperity. God wanted his people to be financially self-sufficient and not have to be a slave to the moneylender who charges interest. Now, I understand that that's not always a possibility. You know, dad dies and nobody wants to farm. But the point is that the monetary value is to remain in the family. You know, switching gears here a little bit, property taxes are another attack on generational prosperity. Taxing a man for a piece of land that his grandfather bought and paid for, 2 centuries ago, that's a violation of God's law. As a matter of fact, Supreme Court Chief Justice John Marshall in the 1819 McCulloch versus Maryland case determined that, quote, the power to tax is the power to destroy. You see, the government has no right to tax something that you own. Once you made $1 and paid your taxes on that dollar, it's your dollar for the rest of your life, and no one has the right to tax it again. So how does a just government tax something over and over again, year after year, perpetually, for something that was paid centuries ago? Well, here's the bottom line. If they can tax it, they can own it. But they do not own it, you do. Listen to what the prophet Ezekiel had to say. He says, the prince, or modern translation, the president, shall not take any of the people's inheritance by evicting them from their own property. He shall provide an inheritance from his own sons from his own property, so that none of my people may be scattered from his property. Ezekiel 46. You see, the prophet Ezekiel saw the future because if you cannot pay your property taxes, the government has the right to repossess your land, even if it's paid for. And the prophet Ezekiel made it very clear that the earth was God's gift to man. It was not God's gift to the government. And who gives the government the right to tax that gift, let alone take it away when a man falls on hard times? This is another perfect example of our government simply overstepping their boundaries. The story actually gets worse. Did you know that you could own a piece of land and not own the mineral rights underneath? You can strike gold in your own backyard and may not even be entitled to it. It all depends on the laws of the state. There are people who have paid good money for a piece of land, only to have an oil company come in and drill sideways underneath their land, a process called fracking, and suck millions of dollars worth of natural gas out of their land, and they got nothing in return. And in some states, mineral rights actually supersede surface rights, which means that a big corporation can come in and basically trash your land, and all you get is compensation for the crops you could have grown in the dirt. Now, how many people would have the money to fight a big corporation over something like mineral rights? No one would. And it's a law that's designed to strip you of your generational prosperity and send it off to big corporate America. As Jesse Ventura would say, don't start the revolution without me. Let's go another direction. Have you ever seen someone hoard all of their wealth right up to the last day of their life? I want to read you a little text of scripture here out of Genesis chapter 25, and it reads like this. Abraham left everything he owned to Isaac, but while he was still living, he gave gifts to his sons, his concubines, and sent them away. Abraham called his son Isaac in, gave him everything that he had, watched him enjoy it, and then the Bible says Abraham breathed his last. You see, generational prosperity, he passed on what he had while he was still alive. Now, I think my preceding generation in life had a really weak view of the word inheritance. My kids might hear it here for the very first time, but when I get to a certain age, I'm going to give them everything I have and say, hey, guess what? Now you can take care of me. But the point is according to Genesis chapter 13, Abraham had become very wealthy in gold, silver, and livestock, which means he had a lot to give away. And this should have been one of those golden moments in life where a dad calls his sons in, stands them before him, and watches them enjoy the reward that he leaves them as he's getting ready to leave this world. So let's learn a lesson from the patriarchs that inheritance is something you give your kids while you're still alive, not when you're dead. You see, giving away your inheritance should be a sacred moment, not a white-knuckle moment. Don't leave it to time and chance. Let me give you a better plan here. As a young man, you receive a financial inheritance via your parents. As a middle-aged man, you manage that blessing and you take care of it as a steward. And as an old man, you pass on that blessing to the next generation. And as a result of that, your kids would have to pay very little interest to the banking cartel to start a business, to buy a home, etc. Here's what they're afraid of. If we could ever get a hold of this concept in the church, within 3 to 4 generations, the banking cartel would probably no longer be needed in America. And that's exactly what they don't want to have happen. Let me give you another interesting statement here in the book of Proverbs, chapter 13. A good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children. Did you catch that? A good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children. Perpetual generational prosperity. You see, banks understand the concept of Proverbs chapter 22 that the rich rule over the poor and the borrower is a slave to the lender. Now, I know we abolished slavery once in America, but I say it's time to do it again. The Bible makes it very clear that debt is slavery. Now, understand if you've worked hard your whole life, you have the right to enjoy your golden years. I'm not trying to rob you of that. But I don't think that God's plan for America was for us to be slaves to the banking cartel. And if we would pass on our wealth generationally like God told us to and stop feeding the money grubbers that are controlling the system, I know for a fact this nation would just simply go a lot better. Now, I also understand that generational prosperity requires generational responsibility. You leave a fool a bunch of money and he usually squanders it, doesn't it? But going back to the mortgage meltdown in 2008, the media kept blaming everything on what they called predatory lending. And I'm not saying that wasn't a problem. That did happen. But during that time, I had friends that worked for a nationally known mortgage company, and they told me that 70% of all foreclosures during the mortgage meltdown were people who lied about their level of income. And part of what fueled this whole meltdown was that under what was called the Community Reinvestment Act, which is something that was created by Congress, these people that worked at these mortgage companies, they had to write out a certain percentage of loans every month to people who did not qualify, or the loan company got fined. Now, this legislation was actually led by a certain Democratic congressman who insisted that we were discriminating against poor people, and we needed to rewrite the rules for getting a loan. So people no longer needed good credit or a respectable down payment, just give them the money. And then there was another president during this time who pushed for something called the American Dream Down Payment Fund, which was a taxpayer fund to fund down payments for people that didn't have it. Again, eliminating another one of those barriers to home ownership. Well, it didn't work. It blew up on our face, and it just about wrecked the economy. Believe it or not, the story actually gets worse. Mortgage companies several years ago came up with this idea called balloon payments. I remember the first time I heard about this, I was stunned. I had some personal friends tell me that they owed so much a month in this house with a balloon payment of $15,000 in 10 years. And I sat there and I thought to myself, I knew for a fact these people could barely afford the payments they were paying on this house at that time. Where are they going to come up with an extra $15,000 in 10 years to walk in and give to the bank? See, it was just another way of getting someone into a home that really couldn't afford that much home. And when these balloon payments came knocking at the door, it was just one more thing that made the bubble pop and the housing market crashed. But the spiritual problem in the middle of all this, it is in the last days, men would be lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, and we wonder why America is in the mess that it's in. Let me impose another simple truth into this equation. When I drive into a big city, I see several 100-story, skyscrapers, big buildings. And I understand how companies like, Microsoft and GM and IBM can afford these kinds of buildings, because they make great stuff that everybody wants, everybody uses, nationally and internationally. They sell it for a profit, and consequently they can afford a 100, story high-rise skyscraper in downtown Manhattan. But how does a bank or a mortgage company that does not make, manufacture, or produce anything of substance afford a building like that? Well, it's the debt we've all accumulated. That's how they afford a building like that. You see, your mortgage payment is $1,000 a month, $800 goes to interest, $200 goes to principal, and that's how they can afford a 100-story high-rise building. See, the entire industry is being fueled by our never-ending passion for things we really can't afford, and thus the debt, and thus the interest we pay, and hey, it works great for them. But let's go back to generational prosperity. I want to tell you a true story here. I had an individual one time, what I would call a casual church attender. When this person's mother died, they inherited a large sum of money, about $125,000 cash and a lot of real estate. And in less than 2 years, this person lost everything, plain bingo. And the only thing this person left their kids was basically a bill for their funeral. See, we forgot that Jesus was big on stewardship, and sadly, when this person died, they had to answer for God for how they squandered their generational inheritance. The sad reality of all this is the reason we do not see more people in the financial industry getting busted for their unethical behaviors, because the whole industry is a culture of corruption. You rat me out and I'll rat you out. I want to conclude this chapter by giving you an interesting quote. In the year 106 BC, there was a Roman philosopher by the name of Cicero that wrote these words: "The budget should be balanced, the treasury should be refilled, public debt should be reduced, and the arrogance of public officials should be controlled." Not much has changed in the last 2,000 years, has it?